I'm not seeing the photo. Okay, are you ready to start, Miriam?
I am ready to start.
Okay.
Okay, let's start it now.
I think everybody's getting into the room. I see the attendees numbers go up. So thank you everyone from the parent centers who are here to listen to some new guidance that has just come out as part of OSERS Return to School Roadmap. Today's webinar is going to cover the important information contained in the IEP guidance. Our speakers are going to be Dan Schreier, Lisa Pagano, and Sabrina Austin from OSEP. And we're going to start off with some comments from David Cantrell, Deputy OSEP Director and acting as OSEP Director right now. So with that, I'll turn it over to David for some opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Carmen. Good afternoon, everyone. I am David Cantrell, the OSEP Deputy Director, and I'm currently serving in the role as acting OSEP Director. So I really appreciate each of you carving out some time to allow us to go over our recent guidance, one of our products called Return to School Roadmap, and we're going to focus on particularly our IEP guidance that we issued in anticipation of this new school year in response to many of the questions that we've received over the last year since the pandemic began. So I'm going to turn it over to Dan Schreier, and he and Lisa Pagano and Rhonda Sortina will go over the document for us today. Thank you very much.
Hey, good afternoon. I'm glad we've exceeded 100 participants. Looking forward to spending the next hour with everyone. Thanks, David, for the introduction. So just before we get started, I do want to give a quick shout out that one of our dear colleagues, Rhonda Weiss, passed away this week. I don't know how many of you have worked with her or know of her, but she was one of our colleagues in the Office of General Counsel and was so instrumental in getting many of our guidance documents issued, including, for those of you familiar with the dispute resolution guidance, our guidance on private schools, many policy letters, worked with us on getting the information about use of funds for the ESSER year, and was involved with us as we had preliminary discussions in preparing this guidance as part of the Return to School Roadmap, and getting ready to brief the Secretary. And then taking it to the next level, which was transitioning to guidance. So she was really instrumental and so supportive of all of the work that you guys do in supporting families in implementing a very challenging statute, as we can all acknowledge. So just briefly, my name is Dan Schreier. I work with David and do policy work for the OSEP Director and OSEP Deputy Director. Joined along with Lisa and Sabrina, Lisa Pagano, who does the policy work for MSEP, as well as Sabrina, who's a relatively new staff member, but also does policy work for MSEP. So we're really pleased to share this guidance, go over it with you guys, and looking forward to fielding some really good questions from you guys as we talk about implementation. So I'm going to get right into it. All right, so I think you guys are all very aware of this, right? But this was sort of one of the key issues or key sort of foundational requirements that we use to build the guidance for the IEP document, which is, right, that IEPs have to be, in fact, for each child with a disability within each LEA's jurisdiction, within the jurisdiction of an LEA at the beginning of the school year. That's sort of idea requirement A1. And then obviously, one of the ways we built upon it is considering special factors. So some of the special factors that we think were, obviously tied into the pandemic was considering assistive technology and also considering the social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health supports for children with disabilities. Clearly, the pandemic has affected lots of children in their mental health and sort of the supports they need to be successful educationally, whether it was receiving instruction remotely or now coming back and having to get used to school norms and and also teachers, right? Teachers need potentially need supports to getting back to having a classroom of 25, 30 kids. Not necessarily easy compared to having been virtually. So the other thing too that we also wanted to stress is recognizing that there's going to be a challenging time for our teachers, special educators, and schools, is that when IDA was reauthorized in 2004, it also provided some flexibilities, whether the amendment process, consolidation of meetings. And so we did want to make sure that, excusal of staff if parties agree, if the parents and IEP team agree. So some of those reminders about some of those flexibilities in that, while an IEP may need to be revised, do we really need to have every provider there if there's no real changes in services? So we wanted to highlight those as well. And those are what questions B1 and B2 provide. The other thing that we really wanted to stress, and this is not something that is new, but sometimes, and I don't know if everyone feels this way, but we really do believe and have for quite a while that the IEP teams are such an important role in making those decisions about a child, right? Not only for their IEP, but also for deciding whether compensatory services are needed for a child. This is, this shouldn't have to, parents shouldn't have to file state complaints, shouldn't have to go to due process hearings or request mediation. IEP teams, and including the parents, should be able to have those conversations, should be able to determine as it says, the extent, whether and to what extent compensatory services are needed for their child. And it's been a longstanding position, whether it's the teacher strikes, natural disasters, earlier pandemics. This is something that we've stated time and time again and reiterated again in this guidance. So we do, in this guidance, definitely say more about compensatory services than I think we ever have in a single document, or maybe have ever said about compensatory services ever. For example, and I know that I believe that Lisa's going to talk about this more in a little bit, but some of those situations where examining what sort of data should an IEP team look at. What are some of the situations where compensatory services should be provided? Is it just the services that were provided in an IEP, or are there other situations? And we do give those other situations where we think compensatory services could be considered. So once again, this sort of highlights the role of the IEP team being able to easily obtain this data. I used to work at an SEA, it's 20 years ago. And typically if we made a finding of non-compliance and ordered compensatory services, what would our typically go-to response be? Back then was LEA, IEP team meet and determine the amount of compensatory services, right? So, once again, is that IEP team is super well suited to make these determinations. This little note in red is kind of a customer service announcement from our attorneys that while we do give lots of examples of compensatory services, and we include some court cases that have done a really detailed analysis of compensatory services, there is no uniform standard, right? We don't have a national standard for compensatory services. So there may be state laws that got passed because of the pandemic. I think we've noticed those. There are court cases that may dictate when compensatory service is awarded, or there might be state courts that have also chimed in on this. So it's really important to look and see and hope that and expect that SEAs are providing good guidance about the appropriate standards for awarding or providing compensatory services. Another real important message that we wanted to highlight was the IDA requirement, and it's in section 608 of IDA, and I'm going to read it exactly, which says that in regards to rulemaking, each state that receives IDA funds shall ensure that any state rules, regulations, and policies relating to IDA conform with the purposes of this chapter, right? And what that essentially is saying in this situation, that when you have children who, when you're addressing the health-related needs of children with disabilities with underlying medical conditions who are at risk of really getting seriously ill if they contract COVID, that IEPs teams need to address health needs of the child. And, you know, it's in addition to following CDC guidance, you know, IEP teams are the ones who should make those determinations. And what we want to make sure that you know, remains the case, right? That's the IEP team's responsibility for children with disabilities, and that it's not taken over by some sort of state law. And what we want to avoid is the situation where a parent has to make this horrible choice, right? Do I go to school in a situation where we're not going to consider the health needs of my child, and the child could become seriously ill, and if he or she contracts COVID, and there are definitely, I think the research is showing that there are children and individuals with disabilities who the underlying medical conditions can make them much more likely to get seriously ill from COVID. So we don't want to have that situation where the IEP team is hamstrung and can't make those health considerations, those school health considerations, and are forced to make the decision of, well, I have to stay home. I have to be home when no one else is, receive services that, you know, are not in the least restrictive environment, or potentially are not providing a free appropriate public education. We're trying to, we don't want to see that happen. And that's why I felt it was important to get this guidance out. And just as a little bit of background, you know, the issue of school-related health needs for children with disabilities, it's been settled by the Supreme Court. This is, you know, almost 40 years now. Teatro came out in 1984. It's a very clear case about a child who needed a catheterization during school, and the district refused to do it. The Supreme Court said, yes, this is not like an extensive medical procedure. The child's siblings could do it, and in order to be at school, it was expected that that was part of the school health services and would be provided and necessary for a child with disability. So, so that's well established and has been resolved. We also mentioned the guidance that is part of state's general supervision responsibilities, and obviously OSEP is the office responsible for implementing IDA. Both have as part of their responsibilities need to ensure that in compliance is, you know, of this requirement is being addressed, and that children whose underlying medical conditions are being met. Another section that we thought was really important based on questions that we were receiving from the field was making sure and clarifying that ESY is not synonymous with compensatory services, right? Our definition of extended school year services is in 34 CFR 106B, and it's very clear and defines what extended school year services are, and that that IEP teams should not be rolling over compensatory services and saying that those are going to be ESY services. They are separate determinations. ESY services should be determined for a child who needs FAPE for, you know, periods beyond typical school years. And compensatory services are obviously addressing disruptions through the pandemic. It's always possible that a child will need both ESY and compensatory services, but once again, as we would expect, separate determinations before those occur. And then finally, I just do want to sort of address this because it is another pillar of the document. We tend, or we've heard that people are relying on special education services and related services as thinking about an IEP, but the additional requirement of supplementary aids and services is really, really important, right? It's sort of that third pillar of services for children with disabilities, and it's the supplementary aids and services are the ones that allow a child with a disability to be successful and receive an education with their non-disabled peers. And it's, and I don't think we think necessarily, I don't think everyone thinks about this as much as they should. So we do want to highlight it. It is raised and mentioned throughout the document. It's a really important set of services that enable a child to be educated in the least restrictive environment hopefully with his or her non-disabled peers. So, so those are my slides. I'm gonna turn off my video and I'm gonna keep trying to move forward as Sabrina and Lisa talk, and we'll hop on later. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Dan. I'm going to go over the next slides, few slides before Lisa takes over at the helm, and then we'll finish up with remarks by Dan. But the slides that I'll be talking about are really focused generally on the requirements relating to the development and the content of the IEP and considerations that the IEP teams must make in order to ensure that each child with a disability receives FAPE. So our guidance reminds LEAs that it's their responsibility to ensure that for each child with a disability, they must have an IEP in effect at the start of the school year. And in order to provide FAPE, the LEAs must also ensure that that IEP identifies and fully addresses all of a child's individual needs. So regardless of the instructional delivery approach, whether services are or were provided virtually, in person, or hybrid, SEAs and LEAs remain responsible for ensuring that FAPE is available to all children. Next slide, please. In addition to conducting the annual IEP review, there are circumstances where LEAs and parents may need to reconvene a meeting to determine whether revisions to a child's IEP are necessary to ensure FAPE. We recognize that for some children, the IEPs that were in effect during full-time virtual learning may need to be revised to reflect the child's needs when they return to learning. We also recognize that as a result of the pandemic, many students will have new or different needs that did not exist at the time their IEP was developed, but which have been brought on following school closures and challenges they've experienced during the pandemic. It's important to keep in mind that in these situations, the IEP teams will need to develop an IEP that clearly identifies any new needs and determine the particular special education related services and supports that are needed to address those needs. In doing so, IEP teams may need to consider whether they have sufficient information about these new or changed needs. Do they have enough to program for that child? Or do they need to determine whether or not they require new updated assessments that may need to be conducted through a reevaluation in order to gather additional information to develop an appropriate IEP? The IEP must be based on a child's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. So it's critical here to understand that you need to have current information in order to develop an appropriate IEP. And noting that IEP teams may develop a contingency plan as a proactive measure to prepare for future long-term school closures, OSEP in this document restates its longstanding position on contingency planning. Specifically, developing a contingency plan would address the provision of service delivery for the situations involving virtual learning or hybrid instruction. And they would include a description of a child's specific services, frequency, type, and duration before circumstances that require a change in the service delivery arise. When developing, revising, reviewing, or a child's IEP, the IEP team must consider several special factors. And I think we're on slides not caught up maybe with where I am. Looks like you're still on 9. Can you progress to 12, please? Thank you. So the guidance document points out and highlights 2 of these special considerations that the IEP teams need to look at in order to ensure that they develop an appropriate IEP. The first special factor for consideration is whether a child needs assistive technology devices and services. The second special factor for consideration is whether a child whose behavior is impeding their learning or the learning of others needs positive behavior interventions and supports to address that behavior. Let's look at assistive technology first. Assistive technology includes not only the actual devices, but also assistive technology services. And I'll touch upon that a little bit more later in the slide. Teams need to realize that several students may have, for the first time, used a laptop or some other school-provided device to access virtual instruction during the pandemic. When teams meet to determine the special education related services, supplementary aids and supports that are necessary for a child to receive FAPE, the IEP teams must consider whether a child also requires an assistive technology device, such as a laptop. When making these considerations, the IEP teams should include information that's provided by both the parent and the child as appropriate. Teams must also consider whether a child requires an assistive technology service. This may include training for the child on how to use the device or coordination with and the use of other therapies, interventions, or services with the assistive technology device. They may also consider the need for parent counseling and training as a related service. As a result of the pandemic, many students will have experienced increased stress, anxiety, depression, disruptions in learning, social isolation, homelessness, and even the loss of a family member or friend due to COVID. These may negatively affect a child's social, emotional, behavioral, or mental health and indicate that they have needs in this area. A child whose behavior impedes their learning or that of others may require new or increased special education related services and supplementary aids and services in their IEP in order to receive FAPE. This slide highlights some of the supports and services that IEP teams may determine a child needs in order to address their social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs. Those include counseling and psychological services, social skills instruction, explicit instruction in stress, anxiety, and depression management, as well as consultation with a behavior specialist to develop a plan of positive behavior supports. Besides these supports and services I just mentioned, the IEP teams may also determine that a child requires program modifications or supports for personnel, such as training on positive behavioral interventions and supports. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to pick up.
Okay, let's see. Are you guys seeing me?
Yes.
Okay, I can't see myself, and that's just fine. Good afternoon, folks. It's nice to be back with you again to share some guidance that we're really proud of and we hope will be helpful to parents of children with disabilities, to teachers, to administrators, all those who are responsible and have an interest in the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Couple things, just want to let you know, we are not highlighting every single question in the Q&A. If you've had a chance to review it, or maybe you haven't. We are interested in your feedback. I want to say thank you for all the wonderful compliments that we're seeing come in through the chat. We appreciate those and your suggestions. It's really rewarding to read your comments that you're finding parts of the guidance so helpful, particularly around compensatory services. We know that's something that folks have been asking for such a long time. You may know from early on in the pandemic that OSEP signaled there would be a need for IEP teams to take a look at whether and to what extent compensatory services would be needed to address the disruptions that children were experiencing as a result of the pandemic. Dan laid out some of the highlights from the guidance. What Sabrina and I are doing now is just kind of going into some of the more specific details to reinforce some of the language that might be useful to pay close attention to. I am thrilled that we're able to talk with you who partner with parents because I think you have a really critical role and you're in a really key position to help parents be able to bring their concerns forward in constructive ways. We've all been made keenly aware of the personnel shortages that are happening throughout the country. And, you know, our guidance makes clear what the requirements are, how those requirements can get carried out with all of the various challenges that are going on. I think that parent center staff are in a really good position, as you've done for years, to be able to counsel parents and guide parents and how to bring their concerns and use this guidance in constructive ways and work as partners with their school staff to make sure that their children's needs can be met. So very appreciative of the opportunity to share this information with you all today. So during the pandemic, we probably received more questions about compensatory services, probably almost than any other topic, including when services might be required, how they get determined, who's responsible for determining them. And so our guidance sets out some examples, which are not meant to be exhaustive. And we provide some suggestions about ways IEP teams can go about making these important decisions, particularly in question D5 of the document. I know for years there have been concerns about some views that compensatory services are only warranted when there have been missed IEP services. And what our guidance does, probably for the first time, is to really identify a variety of circumstances that could warrant compensatory services, not just when an IEP services couldn't be provided for whatever reason. And so you can see on this slide and in the guidance, we address, you know, looking at compensatory services to address delays in completing initial evaluations, which we know there were difficulties in doing that when school buildings were closed. Making those eligibility determinations and getting a proper IEP in place for an eligible child. The second bullet or arrow, when a student doesn't receive all the services that were appropriate to address all their needs during the pandemic, I want you to also think about this bullet as being a situation where, what if the student did receive all the services in the IEP, but they were not delivered in a manner that was appropriate for that child to make progress? So the modality used may not have been appropriate to meet that child's needs. Let's move on to the next slide, please. I do want to emphasize that information from parents is so critical when making these decisions about compensatory services, and particularly during the pandemic when parents were more likely working more closely than the children's teachers, right, with their children. So when IEP teams come together to talk about compensatory services and are starting out with what are the child's current levels, present levels of performance, whether academic or functional performance, including behavior, it's really important that parents have a voice and parents feel comfortable bringing that information to the IEP team, whether it's anecdotal information, perhaps they kept certain kinds of data themselves, excuse me, that they could bring to the IEP team to help inform those decisions about whether compensatory services are needed, and if so, what are the nature and the amount of services that are needed to really properly address and mitigate the adverse impact of the school's inability or failure to provide appropriate services to the child. As Sabrina mentioned, we've really been trying to emphasize that IEP teams should pay close attention, not only IEP teams, but all school personnel, to a child's social, emotional, and behavioral performance. You may have seen the recently released resource that the department had worked on around trying to address the social emotional needs of all children. And certainly IEP teams have that special responsibility for kids with IEPs to make sure that their needs are appropriately addressed in the IEP. We also identified these additional, the first arrow, these other kinds of circumstances when compensatory services might be applicable. Sometimes folks don't necessarily think that compensatory services could be considered for children who have exited special education. If you've been around for a while, you may remember our 2000 letter to Riffle, where OSEP made clear even a child who graduates with a high school diploma, but if they had been denied appropriate services during the time they were eligible, could receive compensatory services to address that denial, notwithstanding the fact they have a high school diploma. You may also remember we issued a policy letter a couple of years ago about children who move out of state, and they could still be would still be entitled to the compensatory services that had been ordered while they were residents in another state to remedy a denial of FAPE. So just wanted to highlight these kinds of circumstances that sometimes people might not necessarily think of. We also, in the guidance, make clear that SEAs, as part of their general supervisory responsibilities, need to be looking at making sure that LEAs take appropriate action to mitigate the impact of these service disruptions. And there was a question in the chat about whether we were collecting or had any data on how often compensatory services discussions are happening in IEP teams. And we do not collect those data. We've heard anecdotally that there are some areas where compensatory services are being addressed at every single child's IEP team meeting when they've returned back to school. This is certainly not something that's dictated through IDEA in terms of how it gets done. But as I responded to the writer, I would hope that our guidance could be helpful to parents and to those who are supporting parents in saying, look, this is what the federal government this is what OSEP has said should be happening for our children who had disruptions in service. So I'm dismayed to read that there are IEP teams saying, if you want to talk about compensatory services, file a state complaint. That's not what our guidance says. And in fact, we talk, and I'll get to this in a minute, about hoping that by looking at compensatory services through IEP team meetings, it can actually lessen the need for parents to file due process complaints, to file state complaints, and to use those kinds of resources, maybe unnecessarily, if the parent and school can reach a suitable agreement about compensatory services through the IEP team process. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so I want to talk just a minute about making educational placements. We thought it was really important in this guidance to reiterate IDEA's least restrictive environment requirements. During the pandemic, our customer service team within OSEP, that's part of my role in addition to working on policy. I support our customer service team, and we have been flooded with questions and concerns from parents primarily about how their children and whether their children and where their children are receiving special education services or instruction in general. In our guidance in section G of this IEP Q&A, we do address the importance of IEP teams and placement teams in making sure that children with disabilities have IEPs that provide FAPE in whatever environment the child is going to be educated. As you all know, likely, no IDEA requirements were waived because of the pandemic, and that includes LRE. You'll see on this slide, we underlined the term supplementary aids and services, as Dan and Sabrina both underscored. We believe, this is really an area that IEP teams could use some extra help with focusing on, and perhaps, as we've presented this information with SEAs and talked with them about providing support and technical assistance to their LEAs to make sure that teams really are coming, the public agency people from the teams are coming to the table, knowing what their responsibilities are in making placements consistent with the least restrictive environment requirements. Let's move to the next slide, please, Dan. So one of the things that we think is important is that LEAs should not be providing virtual instruction to children with disabilities when non-disabled peers are receiving only in-person instruction. We know that there's a lot of interest in virtual instruction, and by some families who are concerned, have health concerns, we address that in one of the questions. But the broader piece is we want to ensure that children with disabilities have the opportunity to attend school safely and be educated with their non-disabled peers. One of the messages we wanted to address, for so long, the department has sort of looked at children receiving services in their home as being the most restrictive environment. Well, that was before so many schools started offering virtual instruction. And you can see in the second bullet here is that when virtual learning is provided in a way that allows children with disabilities meaningful opportunities to still interact with their peers without disabilities and to be educated with children without disabilities, that may actually be a least restrictive environment for that child, even though they're not leaving the house. And many children with and without disabilities did not leave home to receive instruction prior to the 2021-2022 school year. Next slide, please. Oops. Let me say one more thing. Sorry, guys. Just want to acknowledge, and this comes up so much in customer service, the federal government has no role in deciding whether and how the schools deliver instruction in terms of, is it going to be virtual? Is it going to be in person? Will a hybrid model be used? Those are all state and local decisions, but we have encouraged states to pay close attention to how their LEAs offer virtual instruction, to what students, under what circumstances, and to ensure that for children with disabilities, those children have IEPs that will provide FAPE to them through that mode of instruction, including looking at the opportunities for a child with a disability to be educated and interact with other students who do not have disabilities. Okay, now I'm with you, Dan. Don't go anywhere. I'm on your slide. So we have a small section about resolving disagreements. All the requirements remain in effect around dispute resolution procedures. I saw a comment pop up really quickly about, overwhelming state complaint systems and the like, and I think that is a concern. We have again promoted having IEP teams, which include the parents, make those decisions regarding compensatory services as a way to remedy the school district's failure or inability of the school to provide appropriate services, and to really mitigate the need for parents to go beyond that and have to pursue a dispute resolution procedure like state complaints or due process or use mediation. However, we know it's not always going to work out in ways that everybody is happy with the decision that's made. So like any other IEP team decision or proposal, parents may use the IDA's dispute resolution procedures to resolve disagreements about whether compensatory services are needed or the amount and type of services perhaps that the agency, the school proposes. I think you play a really important role, parent training center folks, in your conversations with parents to review and make sure they understand what the timelines are for using these procedures. The pandemic has been going and going and going. If someone waits until it's over and everything is back to quote normal, whenever that may happen, the timelines for using these due process and state complaint procedures can easily pass. So just putting a pin in that as a way of making sure that parents understand if they do want to access these dispute resolution rights, that they need to pay attention to the timelines. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next slide, please. And I think we have a little bit of time to talk about the prior two documents we released. We would like to do that unless there's objection from the audience, to just kind of highlight a few things from the initial document that went out August 24th, our Dear Partners letter that was addressed to both early intervention and special education partners. That certainly includes you guys. And in that initial letter, we wanted to emphasize the importance of infants and toddlers with disabilities and children with disabilities and their families having equitable access to really high quality services, whether it's early intervention or special ed and related services. We also wanted to make no mistake about it, that notwithstanding the challenges of the pandemic, children with disabilities retain their rights to appropriate services under IDEA. We also wanted to set forth the department's expectation that all children would have the opportunity for full-time in-person learning for the 2021-2022 school year. That it, of course, includes children with disabilities, while recognizing that reopening schools safely is of utmost importance, and that SEAs and lead agencies, SEAs and LEAs really should put in place layered prevention strategies in schools to help keep kids safe, to make sure that under IDEA, IEPs are in effect at the start of the school year, and that the other rights provided to children and parents under IDEA Part B are protected. Next slide, please. On this slide, we're featuring sort of some of what we said about oversight and general supervision. And OSEP acknowledged that and reiterated the flexibility that SEAs and state lead agencies have about how, but not whether, they monitor their LEAs and EIS programs and providers for compliance and implementing the IDEA. So we know that, excuse me, states have a number of components in their general supervision systems. They need to use these various components, even when we know that the traditional methods of perhaps doing site visits are not available because of the challenges of the pandemic. We noted in our Dear Partners letter that we're going to be looking at states' implementation of IDEA, including how they exercise their general supervisory responsibilities. But we also wanted to make sure that SEAs and state lead agencies are focusing some efforts on providing technical assistance and support to their local programs, with a particular emphasis on children who were the most impacted by the pandemic, and to ensure full implementation of IDEA during the 2021-2022 school year. So those are some major or key messages from the Dear Partners letter. We hope that you find that letter helpful in sort of setting the speed limit, posting the speed limit for the 2021-2022 school year. We've heard from our early intervention partners that, you know, our insistence on saying things according to school years when Part C just operates year round can create some challenges, but it is easier for us being part of the Department of Education to kind of come out with the return to school roadmap. On the Part C side, it's sort of a return to in-person services, perhaps. So I saw someone's really looking forward to the Part C guidance. We hope to have that in your hands, well, maybe not your hands, but on your screens very soon. Next slide, please. Real quickly, I'm going to run through, we did the Q&A on Part B Child Find. We thought it was particularly important to issue something around Child Find because it has been so long since we have done that. We have Child Find information in several pieces of guidance, but not really anything that you could pick up and say, this is a Child Find document. So we also recognize there were a number of pandemic related challenges to carrying out Child Find that perhaps LEAs and states have not had to quite address before, and that being attributed to the large number of children who didn't register for school or unenrolled from their schools during the past bit. And we are really encouraging SEAs and LEAs to evaluate whether their current procedures, what they're currently doing, is sufficient to meet these additional challenges, or if there's other steps that need to be taken to effectively identify, locate, and evaluate children suspected of having a disability within their jurisdiction. Real quickly, I got 2 more slides. I know there are a bunch of questions and I need to turn it back over to Dan. The Child Find document, you can see we review sort of the general requirements and responsibilities, provide examples of some activities to consider as part of Child Find. We talk about the use of multiple sources of federal funds that Dan's going to jump in just a minute to talk about. We also clarify who can refer a child, who can initiate a request for an evaluation, and what an LEA's response to a parent's request for an IDA evaluation of their child it is to be in terms of if the LEA suspects the child of having a disability, they need to seek the parent's consent to start the evaluation. If the LEA does not suspect, then they need to provide the parent with prior written notice that includes all the required content. On to the next slide, please. So we outlined again just a few of the considerations and wanted to make clear that it's not appropriate to rely solely on parents to be your referral source. That alone will not allow the LEA or an SEA to meet the Child Find requirement. We also wanted to highlight in question C3 the requirement that children are not determined to be a child with a disability if the determinant factor is due to a lack of appropriate instruction in reading or math. We could see how the pandemic would exacerbate the difficulty in teasing out what is disability versus what is lack of appropriate instruction when there was a disruption for so many children. And we are encouraging SEAs to think about providing additional support and technical assistance to their LEAs so they can make appropriate determinations in this regard. And lastly, you may recall our office, along with the Office for Civil Rights, is issued some guidance earlier this year in July that is hyperlinked in the Child Find Q&A that talks about children who are experiencing symptoms from long COVID must be referred if they are suspected of having a disability under IDEA. So I have talked a lot and I'm turning it back to Dan to close this out, and then I'm going to go take a look at some of the questions you guys have been putting in the chat. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Lisa. awesome explanation of the slides and our guidance. So just something that, this is sort of information we've shared with states, is recognizing, yes, there's the teacher shortages are definitely real. The lack of related service providers is real. Definitely know that teachers are feeling overworked and stressed out. But fortunately, Congress has been unbelievably supportive of the Department of Education and our grant programs. This is a very lengthy technical document, the first bullet, but we actually spent a lot of time, and probably to more detail than any other office, described uses of funds for children with disabilities under IDA for the ESSER and GEAR funds, the elementary and secondary emergency relief programs and the governor's emergency education relief program. And so we give a lot of examples of allowable purposes under IDEA, because those funds can be used for any purpose under IDEA. So not just for part B, but also for part C, for part D, our discretionary grants. So there's a wide range of flexibility. And so those funds can also be used for compensatory services. So it's important, and listen, we've stressed this time and time again, but that, if LEAs are saying we have no money for compensatory services or have no money to provide additional services, they do. I mean, at least on, and want to make sure that the special educators are advocating for their funds, that they're going to school board meetings, they're talking with their superintendents, and saying, we have a demonstrable need here for services. This is the largest set of funds and grant funds that the federal government has ever provided to school districts. So, and likewise, 10% of those funds can be reserved for the state level for similar purposes. So it is a hefty amount of money. We're talking $200 billion if you consider the CARES Act, the CARISA Act, and the ARP Act. So it's a significant amount of money. The other things we want to talk in addition to the LEA allocations for IDA under Part B 611, 619, the state level funds can also be reserved for direct services, can be reserved to address personnel shortages. I believe there are 11 different activities under the state level activities that are optional. But once again, states should be talking to their state advisory panel, talking to their LEAs to see how those funds should be allocated. And there will be a sizable increase in the state level funds this year because it's tied into inflation. So there will be a new sort of additional pot of funds, not pot of fund, additional amount that can be reserved for our state level funds. So just wanted to reiterate that, in addition, of course, that the ID allocations went up, and hopefully there will be the additional money that came under the ARP Act. Hopefully that will be the new baseline. And I know the secretary has talked about full funding of IDA. I know the president is very supportive of full funding for IDA. So hopefully we'll continue to see the increases in IDA funds so that we can get to full funding. I think, Lisa, what do we have for questions?
We have a couple good ones that I
Okay.
said we would like to answer live. I hope you agree.
Well, let's give it a shot.
Okay. So the first question, what are some examples of an SEA ensuring that LEAs take appropriate action to mitigate the adverse impact? Should they be sharing this information with their state advisory panels? What could parent centers be looking for? You have thoughts about that?
Well, I think so. A is that, states have that general supervisory responsibility under 301-49, I think, and it's in 300-600. So, and ultimately, when they provide an assurance to us to get their IDA funds, right, they assure that an IEP will be in effect for every child with a disability within their state. It's a pretty awesome responsibility. So to the extent, and when we developed our guidance, we did look at a lot of different state examples, and there are some really good state examples out there about guidance out there. And I know a lot of good virtual Zoom meetings that happened. So there are states that are active, very proactive about this, and have been very cognizant. There have been governors who have said, I want to use our governor's emergency relief funds to provide funding for compensatory services for children with disabilities, because we know that's a problem. So, So I agree to the extent that, you know, I imagine for each district, it's going to be challenging, but to sort of quantify it, right? And to work with their state saying that these are the needs we have. So even if, you know, those state reservations, if reserving some of those for additional like mini grants that can be provided to LEAs to help support LEAs out of their state reservations. But obviously, ultimately, right, they need to ensure that those IEPs are in effect. So, you know, it's a combination of technical assistance, monitoring.
Yeah, I would say as a PTI, or those that sit on state advisory panels, I think it would be appropriate to ask, what have you done? How are you going about doing this? Certainly, you know, when states monitor implementation of IEPs, they can look at prior written notices, they can look at IEP documents, they can, you know, interview staff. Certainly, if there are a lot of complaints coming in, because like the writer said, we're not talking about this in IEP meeting, file a state complaint. I think that's certainly good information for the state to know that this is happening. If you hear those kinds of things, it seems like it would be appropriate to share. But I would see as states monitor IDEA implementation going forward, in addition to looking at whether IEPs are being implemented. In the context of the pandemic, I think they would also be looking at, is there documentation of how they determined this child did or did not need to be considered for compensatory services? The next question says, a parent in our local school district whose daughter ages out the school year has been told that his daughter is not entitled for another year of compensatory services, and has stated that only students who are aging out of the school system during the pandemic are entitled to an additional school year as compensatory services. Can you provide some clarity? And I'm going to take a shot at this one first. So we are aware there are a number of states under state law who have said, hey, we're going to tack on an extra year for you. That is not what our view of compensatory services are. Our view of compensatory services are individualized determinations of whether, and if so, what services, what amount of services. It's not so much a blanket of every kid gets 5 extra hours, right? So even if your state has one of those kinds of programs that adds on, perhaps that's how compensatory services would be provided, but we are not equating those programs as being equal to compensatory services. Does that make sense? Dan, am I saying it right?
Yeah, I think so.
Right. Under our guidance, individualized determinations, and if a state, you know, or local LEA has guidance about how IEP teams determine this, they have to allow for that individualized component, because maybe a whole extra year isn't enough, or maybe what's being provided in that 1 year isn't appropriate. So in terms of accessing the extra year, that would be something outside of IDEA. I think what we would say is, what we've said in the guidance is the child's IEP team needs to make an individualized determination about what that child requires in terms of compensatory services. And then if a determination is reached that yes, the child does require compensatory services, this is the nature and amount, then the IEP team figures out how those services can be provided. One last plug, and it's just a little phrase in this long document, but one of the things that we thought about was, do parents and school staff want to program children from sun up to sundown in order to get all these compensatory services in? And to really be mindful of, are there opportunities for non-academic experiences and to participate in sports or after school or community activities, to be very mindful of the kind of experience that team is putting together for the child. It's important that the losses be mitigated, but to be mindful of how to go about doing that And that's all I'll say. I think I'm going to stop talking now. Thank you again so much for this opportunity. Please feel free to forward any additional questions through whatever channel you normally do. And again, we appreciate the commendations and your suggestions for enhancing the guidance. Thank you.
And I just wanted to say that people can submit additional questions to their project officers, and we'll make sure that we get them to Dan and Lisa and figure out the best, and Sabrina, and figure out the best way to respond to you all. So thanks again for being on this webinar. It will be uploaded to the SIPR website in a few days with closed captioning and interpretation. Both the Spanish and the English channel will be uploaded to the SIPR website, so you can review this. So thanks again, everyone, for participating. And thanks so much to our panelists, Dan and Lisa and Sabrina and David. Take care, everyone. Is the recording stopped, Miriam? I wasn't sure if it had stopped.
It shows that it's still being recorded.
Okay.